Hello everyone and welcome to episode 10, part 2 of KERV. It's our first two-parter of the series and that means we are joined again by Barry Simpson. Barry, welcome to the podcast. How are you?
Buddy. Good to see you.
Good to see you, absolutely. So obviously in the first part that we did, we spoke a bit about your journey, about putting businesses through the flotation and your experience, a lot of that. In this part, obviously there is more insight to give, so I'd like to touch upon a bit more about recruitment. Obviously your experience in that and a bit more insight for our viewers and listeners in there. So to start this part off, from those viewers and listeners who maybe haven't watched part 1, which I would recommend you go and do.
Yep.
Give us a little bit of background into yourself, Barry, in terms of your story and where you've been.
Yeah, so recap, 35 years in recruitment, primarily technology recruitment with financial services as a backdrop. So my recruitment journey started off as a recruitment consultant through to running a business, building a business, floating a business, starting again, running a business, building a business, selling it, then starting again, and then joining a large consultancy and being part of the leadership team that got that sold, and then various other transactions, but all related to recruitment. So my DNA for the best part of 4 decades has been in recruitment.
Mm-hmm. Fantastic. I won't waste any time. I'll get straight into today's topics. Obviously, you've got a little bit of experience, well, not a little bit, a lot of experience in contract divisions.
Yep.
And building those contract divisions. Why is contract recruitment, do you think, such an important revenue stream for businesses in the recruitment industry?
Well, stating the obvious, the difference between contract revenue and permanent revenue is that contract revenue is probably more reliable on an ongoing basis if you've got good clients with good durations and good profit margins. So theoretically, you're coming into work every month knowing that you've got guaranteed income coming through the door rather than relying on having to do transactions or permanent deals to create that revenue. And it allows you then to strategically start to plan based on guaranteed revenues. Mm-hmm. So it's a real game changer for businesses that want some form of stability and some continuity around being able to manage their balance sheets. Mm-hmm. Plus also, if you have aspirations to sell a company, you're far more valuable with that recurring revenue than you are if you're just a permanent recruitment shop. Mm-hmm. So they're the real differences, the two differences.
What in terms of recruitment business or individual business leaders who are thinking maybe of getting into it, who might have some cautious thoughts about it, what are the common misconceptions that maybe come with that contract recruitment and those contract divisions?
Well, I think contract recruitment is easier said than done. Compliance, finance, contractual arrangements, having that know-how and being able to leverage various partners that can give you the expertise is not to be shied away from. So contract revenue sounds great, but it is easier said than done. So you do have to invest time in understanding, particularly where I've come from historically, which is the UK. UK recruitment in contract, there are pieces of legislation that can determine whether you are compliant or non-compliant. For example, IR35. IR35 is a game changer, has been since its inception, since 2008, and it's changed in various ways, but more so now, it is a piece of legislation that has teeth. And if you get it wrong and you do not adopt the right working policy, it can be financially crippling. Mm-hmm. So it has its challenges. Mm-hmm. So you do need to make sure that you are compliant and that you've got the right kind of advice behind you.
Mm-hmm. In terms of that compliance side of things, then obviously you spoke a little bit about that. How important is that side of things if you're looking at getting into the contract division side of things?
Well, if you depending on the size of your organisation, I would strongly recommend you have some form of partnership with a compliance type organisation that can guide you through how to do contracts with various locations, not necessarily UK, but Europe or the US or Latin America. Each location has got different needs. So therefore, one thing I've learned very, very quickly is that utilising specialist organisations that can add value to your service delivery is probably the thing that you've got to have. Whether you're a one-man band or whether you are a PLC, you need these organisations in your camp all the time, because I don't think you can have knowledge of every single thing. So therefore, outsource it.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. With the misconceptions that people have, I mean, you've spoken about compliance then and being quite an important factor. How do businesses overcome those misconceptions that they maybe have about contract recruitment?
Well, more often than not, if you're going to go down that contract route and you have no experience whatsoever of doing that, then you need to engage someone who can. So I think it's first port of call with any recruitment agency would be, does your current client base facilitate contract opportunities? Or is it just a permanent recruitment model? So if it does, then it's very easy to engage in that scenario and then seek advice when the opportunity arises. But if you don't have a client base that can give you contract opportunities, then you need to go and hire people that can commercialise that.
Mm-hmm. So essentially, a lot of it, if you can't do it yourself kind of thing, you've got to build that team around that then. Absolutely. How important is that then to be having that?
Well, I think nowadays, hiring someone who is fit for purpose is probably key in the success of that business. So therefore, if you can afford it, I would advise hire someone who's done it before, who knows the lay of the land, who potentially has the contacts that you need in order to get this off the ground. Mm-hmm. Because not only do you need compliance, you also need finance. Mm-hmm. Because finance in a contract deal in its isolation, more often than not, the contractor, unless you adopt a paid when paid model, which most contractors won't adhere to, most contractors want to work a month and get paid. Clients potentially, if you're dealing with decent organisations, won't pay you for 60 days, 90 days. Mm. So you have to finance potentially 3 months worth of work for one individual. Mm. Now, if you're paying someone £500 a day, that's 2,500 a week, that's 10 grand a month. You physically have to find that money just to simply pay the contractor. Mm-hmm. So you have to finance that. Now, there are various organisations globally that can do that for you. But unless you know contract recruitment and the pitfalls of having to finance a deal, then don't go anywhere near it.
Mm-hmm. You spoke about affordability then for people who obviously can get that external help maybe and bring someone in. What about those that can't maybe or at that stage then in terms of affordability? What would you recommend to those? Is it more research thing? Is it more you need to really get immersed in that to understand it? Or
well, if you are a recruitment business and you are a permanent recruitment business primarily, my advice would be either build up the revenues and the cash that would facilitate hiring someone potentially to come and do it for you, or go to the bank, borrow the money. But it's a big decision because there are lots of recruitment businesses that don't do contract recruitment because it is volatile, it has a risk attached to it, and it is a completely different business model to permanent recruitment. Although you're picking jobs up and you're filling them, there's still probably more that you need in the background in terms of operational support for contract recruitment than there is for permanent recruitment.
Mm-hmm. Once a contract division's in place then, what steps do businesses need to take who've taken that leap need to then take to effectively scale that specific division, would you say?
From experience, I've seen this a lot with recruitment companies that I've competed against, is that make sure that you maximize the opportunities that exist within the clients that you've already opened the door to and proved that you can successfully deliver a service. So make sure that every individual who's cracked open a client is maximizing the opportunities within that client before you even entertain going and opening up more clients. So never leave money on the table and go and look elsewhere, because you open the door for someone like me to come in and do that on your behalf. And before you know it, you're no longer part of the scene. So to scale a contract business, you need good clients that are going to give you ongoing activity. You need to respect that activity and not take that for granted and cherish the opportunities that you get. So if you replicate that, you'll begin to scale. And you'll scale in a way that facilitates ongoing opportunities based on quality of service.
So is it a repetition thing, would you say, in terms of having that model in place, in terms of what you're doing and what you're going out and setting your stall each time in that way? Nothing changing too much, really, just sticking to what you know and then essentially multiplying that and doing that again.
Very interesting subject that I subscribe to and unknowingly have always done recruitment this way, is patterns of ways of working. And that is repetition. So if you understand what the pattern looks like for success, first of all, you have to understand what it looks like. Then you can repeat it. And you can repeat it and utilize that pattern to leverage other opportunities. So the pattern is, without a shadow of a doubt, win a client, deliver to the client, make that client experience one that they enjoy and they will come back. Repeat that. Constantly do that, because I think you leave no stone unturned and no door open for anyone else to come in and step on your territory. So I've seen clients built from one placement with huge blue chips to 200 contractors working within one environment. And the remit was, and it's a phrase that I don't like to use that often, but it is, you land and you expand, but you do it in a way that everyone feels that it's a nice experience rather than a bull in the china shop mentality.
With that repetitive patterns, like you just said, do you ever change those patterns as well? Like obviously, when you go on again and again, maybe to evolve and adapt, like you say, is the little tweaks that you make maybe in?
You have to be agile, because market forces will change. I think we discussed previously, the economies of scale will change based on whatever is going on in the globe at the time. You know, when we look back over the 35 years that I've worked in recruitment, there have been various events that have dictated you must change your way. For example, well before your time, but Y2K. Y2K was a period of time when everyone thought that computers weren't capable of going to zeros. It would revert back to the 19s. But it did. It happened. But it was a bit of a white elephant, because there was a massive purge on recruitment building Y2K machines. You know, then you come to the credit crunch in 2008, when who thought that a AAA investment bank would go bust in Lehman Brothers? You know, so again, if you were not adapting at that time and pivoting through those cycles, then you're probably not here today.
Yeah, and I guess that's how much the recruitment landscape has changed over the time, which we will come to a bit later. But there's a lot of things that have obviously happened in that time. With businesses then in the life cycle, we all know that I think not just in recruitment that there is peaks and troughs, absolutely. I think businesses can obviously sometimes lack that inspiration, and it's then finding that way to inspire them to get back to that peak instead of being in the trough. What are the biggest signs in a business that it's lost its momentum, would you say?
Again, you as a leader, you have to have various processes built into your model that will pick up on the troughs that are occurring, so that you can head off long periods of underperformance, shall we say. So things like constantly reviewing the business in terms of its output, its performance, and then correcting it, whether it be individually or collectively as a team, so that you have these kinds of levers that you can leverage all the time. So as a leader, it is your fundamental responsibility and your duty of care to make sure that individually everyone within your business is or has the right tools, the right levels of guidance, tuition, everything they need to be the best version of themselves. So that's how you maintain a consistent level of performance, so that you don't get this feast and famine kind of performance, because more often than not, feast and famine is a consequence of leadership being inconsistent.
Mm-hmm. How can leaders recognise then when it's time for that change? You spoke a little bit about leadership then, and leaders. How do they then spot that it's time for that change?
Well, first of all, you've got to be engaged all the time. You know, you can't just think that I'm a business leader and now I've made it and I've got a group of people that supposedly know what they're doing. It is your responsibility as the business leader to make sure that you are measuring. Now, some use KPIs. I have a version of KPIs. I tend to think that KPIs are noise that you listen to when you feel that something is awry in the business. And KPIs are things like, what is the output of the business fundamentally? Where are people in the cycle of recruitment? So do you have a group of people that don't have any requirements? And if so, you know what you have to go and do with that. Do you have people that have got requirements that are not converting that into interviews? So you have, I mean, recruitment is a very basic thing. You know, you need clients that give you jobs. You need candidates that give you CVs. And you need those CVs to be converted into interviews, and you need to be maximising the control element through the process. So a business leader has got to have their finger on that pulse more often than not, without having a controlling influence that potentially can sometimes be a bit big brother.
Yeah. How would you say that leaders can reinvigorate their teams then, and bring that revived energy for a potentially stagnant business, would you say?
Well, I've never been part of a stagnant business because I think by the nature of who I am, I see everything as half full rather than half empty. And I have a need to feel that I am fully aware of people's motivations, expectations. So I think if you have a stagnant business, it isn't the good thing about recruitment. It's not difficult to rein that back and bring it back into positive territory. And you have to have the I can do mentality, that we can change this around very, very quickly. But you cannot let it drift for weeks and months. And that's where businesses tend to die, because they've been left to drift for far too long.
So really it's about that constant evaluation, I guess, in terms of, I mean, it's expected probably anyway from a business, and it might seem a bit obvious, but that is probably an important key factor in
it's
that.
Key. I mean, it's also empowering your people to know that if there is an issue, however small or large it is, that they can put their hand up and say, I'm either not enjoying this, or we have a problem, or I'm struggling. You need to be able to create that kind of business where people feel that they can put their hand up.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a bit like being back at school. You know, if you're in the classroom and the teacher says, "Does everyone understand?" I guarantee you, everyone's going, "I'm not putting my hand up."
Mm-hmm.
And yet, more often than not, the person that does put their hand up is the one that learns the quickest.
Mm.
You know, and I've built recruitment companies very much like that. It takes courage to say I'm struggling or that I don't understand. I think that's a courageous thing to do, and I will shake the hand of that person over and above someone who says, you know, I'm too afraid to say it.
Mm-hmm. No, go on. Sorry,
That's,
I was literally just going to push on that point. Really, that must be an important thing then for not just promoting that culture, but also, you know, having someone to have that courage and maybe put themselves forward. How would you say that's as influential for people to be like, oh, look, you know what, I don't actually understand what's going on here? Because that can be a fearful thing. You're right, like that school mentality. Yeah. And especially in a business when you maybe looking up at someone who is maybe that leader of the busy thing, and well, he's going to think I'm not doing.
Well, I think it's a fear of being seen to be either a failure or it's seen as a weakness to not say I'm struggling. But I think, I mean, particularly in modern day, with mental health and what have you, I see it as a strength. That I see it as a positive that someone can come to me and say, I didn't understand what you said. Can you explain that more? And I would gladly do that. Over and above someone who goes away and continues to repeat bad habits. I think in a sales environment, you encourage people to be far more transparent now. And sadly, I think there are sales environments where that fear factor of either losing your job or being ridiculed, definitely not a business that I've built. I've built a business that there is fear for non-performance, but there is definitely a platform for people to say, I disagree.
How important is that balance then? For, I mean, not just pushing people on fire, but having it so the people feel like, look, I can still speak to this person, but I'm also know that I'm pushing for targets and whatnot. How important is that balance?
I think that the standard that's set from top down is crucial to expectation management. Mm-hmm. If the standard, and this is standard being everything, the way that they look, the way that they talk, the way that they behave, their history, everything. If the standard is high, you tend to find that the business comes up to that level. And if you can maintain that standard, that does create a tier of expectation that I can't maintain that. Now, as long as it's realistic, because I have seen environments where they've set unrealistic standards based on thin air, as long as the expectation is realistic, then there's no reason why people can't be held accountable for that.
Mm-hmm. How much of a company's drive and direction then comes from the leadership team, would you say?
I think it's twofold. The leadership team needs to be consistent and it needs to be available and aware of what its responsibility is. But I think you've also got to empower that succession of the next gen leadership so that they have the autonomy to feel comfortable. They can go away and deal with stuff rather than having to rely on all the decisions made by the top tier. So I think it's a balance between empowering the would-be next gen and ultimately having to make the decisions that sometimes can be the tough ones.
Mm-hmm. Well, it leads me on sort of to my next open question, really. I've said about the leadership team, how important is it for then consultants to then back that who are underneath the leadership team to push that drive and direction? How important is that as well?
You'll find, if you talk to me for a long period of time, you'll find that consistency is key. So as long as, and I've been doing some coaching today, as long as everyone feels that they have got a fair playground with the rules laid out, that if I do this, I get that, I think you get harmony through a business. I think you get, everyone knows where everyone stands and everyone feels comfortable that it is a fair playing ground within the business. There is no agendas, there are no clicks. It's basically do the best you possibly can and you will be happy and you will be rewarded. And that comes from top all the way down.
Mm-hmm. We've spoken a bit about the troughs of a business, you know, when you're in that potential slump at the business, and maybe you're then looking towards sort of re-strategizing. You're thinking, oh, it's time for us to seek new revenue opportunities then. How do the business leaders that we spoke about, how can they identify that it's maybe time to rethink strategy and explore those new revenue streams?
I think a growing business is always evaluating new markets and new clients. So again, if you've got some form of business model that almost stops the business on a regular basis, evaluates it, and you can bring to that evaluation process things like, are our clients using us to our maximum? Are we exploring the markets as we should? I think that's the revolving cycle of evaluation. So it has to be done on an ongoing basis so that you are always relevant at the right time with the right markets and the right clients within those.
Mm-hmm. What would you say are some of the most overlooked revenue opportunities for businesses in recruitment, would you say?
I think the point I made earlier, missing the opportunity to maximize existing clients and thinking that the definition of business development is new clients. And you do need to keep that because that is actually the real world. You do need to have a balance of new business coming through, but it not at the consequence of maximizing the opportunities that you've already got. So I think a lot of businesses do walk away from companies that they've had a successful trading history with, but it could be that someone's left and their relationship has moved on. Mm-hmm. You still have to maintain that relationship with that client. So one thing I've always been very successful with is managing relationships to a degree where you almost become the go-to, the one-stop shop for those businesses.
Mm-hmm. Would that, obviously we spoke about contract recruitment, would that then lead to a sort of retainer sort of deal through that? Would it, have you
I think in contract recruitment, you're not talking now the traditional contingent, what I would classify as contract recruitment as we knew it. Mm-hmm. Retained contract recruitment has evolved into more statement of work, consultancy-led, program management-led. We're now moving into probably where a lot of recruitment firms have evolved. So they've gone from that competitive preferred supplier list, I'm going to compete with 4 or 5 agencies, and we all get the same job at the same time, and it is a race to the bottom in terms of who can find the candidate and close the deal. I know a lot of recruitment firms that have evolved from that. It still forms a part, but they've bolted onto, which was from my previous firm, who was a consultancy, they bolted onto that model, more of a consultative type model that you tend to find with what I would classify as the top 4 KPMGs, PwCs mm-hmm. of this world, where they will sell a solution and you will then ultimately own that as a retained program of work. So does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. You might want to go on a little bit depth.
Well, what I would say is that the difference between contingency and solutions is that, in layman terms, mm-hmm. contingency is theoretically you're working for free. So you get given a requirement, the chances are someone else has got it as well, and you both got to go and find a candidate, and it's competitive, and therefore you have no retained solution there. So if you fill it, great. If someone else fills it, not so great. A statement of work solution could be more than one hire, but they want a program or a project delivered. And you then have to come back and say, well, that's going to be 5 or 6 people with 5 or 6 different skill sets, and we're going to wrap that up as a solution with one cost. Clients sometimes like to outsource that problem, and recruitment agencies have stepped into that pocket probably over the last 5 to 10 years because they've seen a gap in the market from, I don't want to be contingent, I don't want to have to compete with a preferred supplier list of 5 or 6. I'm going to offer a solution now. And that's what consultants have been doing for years. But recruitment agencies have tried to bridge that gap. And one thing that really drove that, I think a lot of people will smile when I say this, was IR35.
Right.
IR35, when it changed model roughly in 2018, 2019, when the government changed the model of IR35, recruitment agencies tried to come up with an angle to navigate around what was a limited company solution then, but when the government changed it, it converted to a PAYE model. So all of a sudden, contractors who were operating under their own limited companies were now susceptible to having to pay PAYE because of IR35, which is probably a topic for another day. But IR35 actually is probably, when we get onto it, one of the biggest game changers in recruitment. And it changed the game for a population that you probably see left the UK recruitment agency market because of it. But because I slightly digress, the reason that I think that the retained contract solution is more lucrative now is probably been generated from IR35.
Right. Expand on that then, because I know you're saying that you might not. I'm happy to go ahead with it and speak up a little bit about this. Yeah,
so,
definitely.
IR35, Inland Revenue 35. It was a piece of legislation that was brought out in 2008, and it was to determine the working practice of a contractor. Because back in the day, a contractor could set up his own limited company and pay himself in a creative way that was very different and very lucrative to a PAYE individual. And the determination was, and I'll give you an example, 2 people go to work, one's a contractor, one's a PAYE individual. They both do the same job, they're both reporting to the same guy, they're both under the same control, they work the same hours, but one guy is getting paid in a different taxation regime than the other. Is that fair? Now, I hear contractors screaming now that, yes, it is fair, right? Because we take on the risk of we could be out of work in 3 months, 6 months. I hear them screaming that, right? And it's valid. However, there are lots that had contracts for 5 years with the same company, and therefore it becomes an employment issue. So the government have tweaked it all the way through since 2008, and they then finally changed it. So back in 2008, it was the contractor or the agency's responsibility to make that determination that it's a limited company contract.
Right.
And you had very few PAYE contractors, if any. Now, it is not I can't make that determination, nor can the candidate. It is the client's responsibility. And if the client makes the wrong determination, i.e., they say it is a contract limited company as opposed to a PAYE scenario, if there is a determination made by HMRC that it should have been PAYE, the client is liable for the tax. Right. So in 2018-ish, most big organisations made what was called blanket determinations for all of their contractors to be inside IR35, which is the determination of PAYE. Right. So overnight, you had contractors that were limited companies having to pay PAYE tax. So it was a bit of a game changer. Agencies thought back then, well, the workaround is to create some form of statement of work, like the big consultancies did. But big consultancies were operating on a model that we won't get paid until we've delivered that project. Whereas what recruitment agencies were trying to do back then was navigate that with a statement of work umbrella, but still adopting the contractor model. And that's non-compliant. And recruitment agencies were misrepresenting contractors by setting that model up. But I think it's become far more mature now. And there are lots more recruitment firms that I've read about and respect that have now got proper solutions that will navigate the IR35 scenario. And in some cases, like my previous company, you employ them yourself. And they're permanent employees on good salaries. So they get all of the benefits. So another thing that a contractor will argue, and rightly so, is that those two people doing the same job, one contractor is not going to get any benefits, whereas the permanent guy will. So there are swings and roundabouts. But such was the difference in take-home pay that I think the government just clamped down on non-compliance from a working practice perspective.
Interesting. I'm learning a lot here, and I'm pretty sure our viewers and listeners will be off that as well. You are right. I will have to move on just with another couple of questions, but that, really insightful, that one, Barry. Thanks for that. Back to the sort of re-strategizing and seeking new revenue opportunities then. What are the biggest mistakes that companies make when they're trying to re-strategize, would you say?
I think you can overthink it. I think you can overthink the way that our markets move. I think have a plan on what markets you want to be in and why. Break that down in terms of the clients that exist within that market. So map the market correctly, and simply just make sure that you are reaching out to that decided market with the right communication consistently, day in, day out, because Rome wasn't built in a day. And therefore, if you've adopted the right strategy and you've mapped your market, then approach it in a respectful, professional manner and do that over a period of time.
Do you sometimes think you said about overthinking it, is it sometimes the case of there's too many cooks in the kitchen, like there's a lot of noise coming in? Is it all sometimes about just going back to maybe what you know and simplifying the process?
Well, if we get onto the topic of what things I've seen change over the many years, one thing I do is a bit of a pet hate is that there are too many voices in our market. When you look at social media now, there are people that are making a living out of giving advice on what you can do, what you can't do. I think sometimes you can listen to too many people. If you are lucky enough to work within a company that has got 2 or 3 people that have got deep enough knowledge of their lane that you can leverage and tap into, then you're very lucky. Because more often than not, you get one individual who is very good at what they do that may not be as engaged in the business as they once were. And you've got everyone else who's just literally cutting their teeth as they go.
You led me nicely into the next topic, which is how the recruitment landscape has changed. Obviously, you've is it 35 years that you've been in the recruitment industry now?
Yep.
A fair few decades, and a lot has changed in that time. Digital era's come along. You said about these new compliance things coming in. There's a lot that's happened in there. And I'm sure you've touched upon some of these. But what do you think are the biggest shifts from when you started in recruitment up to now?
Well, I have to say technology, because I think as we sit here right now, there are more and more recruitment firms using more and more technologies to maximise their operation and the opportunities that they're seeking. I'm a firm believer that technology has a place in recruitment, but not at the expense of what ultimately, as human beings, we are built to be able to do, and that is interact physically with another human being to understand the need or the requirement or the pipeline. I think technology can give you so much of an edge, but at some point, a human being has got to step in and execute. But so technology, without a doubt. I think social media is far more vibrant now, given the amount of noise that is coming out of social media in terms of advice, coaching. I tend not to listen too much to too many people. I have a few that I go to that I will listen to, and remind myself of good practice. So technology, social media, work from home. I mean, COVID was a game changer. I think pre-COVID, working from home on a Friday, say, was an absolute luxury. That you'd ask your boss, is it okay if I work from home on a Friday? And you got the green light, you'd be thinking, wow, I've got a long weekend here. I don't have to get on the train in the morning and I don't have to wait for the train in the evening. So, but now, having sold a company through COVID, when we left our business, our office in March 2020, and we never went back, and we interacted through Teams. And prior to that, Teams was an ad hoc tool that we used, but everything became really, really transactional. And I think that that's something also that's occurred over the last 3 to 5 years, is that because of Teams and because of the work from home mentality, and also with contractors and permanent staff now introducing it into their remit of, I want a job that pays me X. I also want a job where I can work from home. You would never have had that years ago. And it's just come up from nowhere. And I think that's a bit of a game changer. And clients have had to adapt, as well as recruitment firms have had to adapt. So I think the work from home model, the compliance has got tighter. I think more firms are global now. Recruitment agencies have definitely sought their revenues from fields further. I think the UK market historically has always been saturated, but I think it's become less lucrative in terms of its saturation. And I think clever recruitment firms have decided to seek revenues further afield, and rightly so. And I think in doing that, you need to make sure that you are able to trade in those regions, which is why you need partners that are capable of setting you up. So I think there's the landscape of recruitment from when I joined in 1990, where there probably wasn't as many of us. There was definitely nowhere near preferred supplier lists, PSLs, through to clients outsourcing their resourcing to big organisations, and you having to take one step back. So the supply chain, I think, has changed from dealing directly with the client through to having to deal with someone who the client has given the responsibility to manage you, and therefore you reduce your margin. So I think there's been a whole plethora of changes in 35 years that it would be very hard to say one thing was a game changer, but unless you've pivoted and you've adapted, you wouldn't have survived for 35 years. You've either called it a day and said, recruitment's not for me, it's too tough, not enough money in it, or you have made some decent money and you've said, I don't want to work it anymore. Or if you're like me, I just love recruitment, and I love seeing people win at what they do through their hard endeavours.
Absolutely. It's rewarding, isn't it, to see them kind of things? Absolutely.
Recruitment industry is a giver. It will give to those that give back, but it's also a taker. If you do not give the right dedication, application, it will crush you.
You spoke about that human touch side of things, moving away from that maybe more so now, which is unfortunate. And I think with that side of that rewarding thing, a lot of that is through that human touch. How much would you say maybe we need to come back to that more, or is it is it moving further away from that, unfortunately?
Well, I think if you're not careful, the modern day recruiter will utilize various AI technologies to spam clients, spam candidates with one size fits all. And bearing in mind, that's all they've ever known. You know, one thing that I find when I go into recruitment companies is that if that's the only recruitment company they've ever seen, then that's the only thing they ever know. And therefore, I find it is my responsibility to open their eyes to what can be achieved if you combine technology to drive output and also improve internal efficiencies from an operational perspective. But it cannot replace the human touch of someone talking to someone and having to either negotiate or just generally interact. I think that's probably the single biggest plus for me that I will never ever lose sight of, is that pick the phone up, go and meet, and touch skin.
I think there's probably is with the work from home situation coming through from COVID as well, and at times there's been probably a push away from people interacting more. I think that it's been a big trend from what I've seen. I mean, not just in recruitment, but as a whole. There's that whole side of, you know, people like to work like from home, but by themselves potentially, and not saying it's a bad thing for some people, but potentially a more introverted behaviour potentially that's come from that. With that, then, would you say that has had a negative effect potentially? Then
I don't think recruitment survives with a full remote workforce. I think you don't create a culture. I think the recruitment's hard enough, and you do need to have some form of DNA and culture where people can go to work and feel that they're not alone. I mean, for example, when we sold the last company, I was responsible for a lot of youngsters who had only known working in an office. And I found me thinking constantly, how are they working from their home now in their bedrooms? Bear in mind, a lot of these people were working in tiny little houses every day. And you were asking them to do 8 to 10 hours a day of recruitment. I think that's just not sustainable. So therefore, I think it is a road that you dare not go down if you are a recruitment business owner. You do want to encourage people to come into the office, because I think recruitment is also about celebrating the successes of your colleagues, and building upon that and making people feel that they belong somewhere. I think, I mean, again, I've only ever known recruitment, but I do think that it does apply to a lot of environments in sport as well, where you do need to feel that you belong to something that is going somewhere, that feels successful, that you can almost call your second home. I mean, I would think nothing of, back in the day, of going and having a coffee with someone and driving for 2 hours, right? Because I felt it was in my interest to do that. Whereas now, just set up a Teams call. That might be more efficient, right? Might be more efficient. And that might be what the client wants as well. Because I think another thing that has changed is that in the 90s, there was no such thing as the anti-bribery laws, where you could take a client out for dinner, you could give them tickets to a sporting event. You can't do that now, right? So there is a change in the dynamic of what you can and can't do. But I still believe that you can go and see a client on their site, have a coffee, talk about what life is about, and I think from a sanity perspective, you do need to do that. You need to get out of those pajamas and out of the bedroom and get amongst it.
I think with the changes that have happened over the years that you've been in recruitment, there is them negatives potentially with that, but it's also got them positives also. I think we do need to probably look at that in terms of the preference of the client. You know, the client that they're working with, they might prefer to just have them, you know, them Teams calls instead of that 2-hour catch up. So what positives would you say then?
Well, I think Teams calls works really well, particularly if you're a UK-based firm trading in the US or Europe. So not everyone wants to jump on a flight and go and have a coffee with someone who's on the west coast of the US. So it has its place, for sure. It definitely has its place. And I think it can be far more convenient to do it that way. So I think the global landscape does facilitate that kind of technical and transactional way of working. But I think if the client is in your vicinity or the candidate is in your vicinity, you should be meeting these people.
We've touched on it slightly. Well, we've touched on it a lot there. But looking more into this, how has technology and data changed the way the recruitment businesses operate, would you say?
Well, I, for one, have evolved to a more of a data-led business owner. So more often than not, when you first start out, a lot of it is gut instinct. You're in the business, you can get a feel for when people walk through the door, how they feel, how they're behaving, how they're performing. I think that today's modern age needs some form of validation of fact. And with data, depending on what kind of data you go after, you can't debate that it's not fact. So I can see, how many calls someone's made. That's a fact, and I can question why. So I think that recruitment firms are far more data driven now, based on everything, the whole package, client interaction, workforce interaction. So I think it's probably one of the biggest things that as a business owner you should be mindful of is the data that exists within your business and how you manipulate it and use it to make a positive impact on the business.
We've spoken a bit about obviously the 35 years that you've been in and in recruitment, Barry, and the experience that you've had throughout that time. Looking on then to the future, what do you think are potentially major trends that are coming up now or starting to emerge, or what you see as potentially emerging in the next, say, 5 years in recruitment?
I think recruitment firms will continue to explore new territories. So places like, and I know they are already there, but not to the degree that they are in other locations, places like Latin America, China, maybe when it settles down, places like Russia. There will be locations that you just have to go and explore and seek out new revenues. Particularly, I suppose, if you're dealing with global organisations. One thing big recruitment agencies have explored is if they're global, they portray themselves as being capable of trading globally. So I think if you are lucky enough to deal with a global organisation and you have a mandate to trade with them, then you should be looking to explore what other locations can you release a mandate to trade with. So I think moving forward, next 5 years, I think we'll see more and more recruitment firms physically moving to the US, which for the next 4 years, I think you'll see growth under the new administration. So I do believe that there's still lots of growth in the US. I think Europe still has a market. I think the UK less so. But I think emerging markets is where recruitment agencies will be. I mean, the Middle East is still a very, very highly sought after market to trade within. But again, going back to, you need to understand the nuances of what you can and can't do, and how you can and how you can't trade in those businesses. So I think the smart recruiter or business owner will invest their own time in understanding what these locations represent. And that's where I think where KERV comes into its own. We have a ability to make changes when we need to make changes, and we have a strategy that we are beginning to roll out that will validate that and allow existing business owners to enter those markets, because we want to take them there. And any would-be recruiter who wants to set their own business up, or a recruiter that wants to join one of our existing businesses, we can take them on that journey. So we see that journey. It's clear. And therefore, I think the KERV model is set that we've got a combination of vehicles that you can join at any one time and explore what we think is going to be the future.
Fantastic. Before we finish, I always ask my guests this golden question. What one piece of advice would you give to potential business leaders, potentially someone who's looking to re-strategize, or they're looking to get into contract recruitment potentially? What's one piece of advice that maybe you followed or you can encourage for people?
I think there's always a peer or a body or someone out there that has trod the path before. Seek that advice, because I think one thing that is really, really positive about our industry is it can be collaborative, and it will open its doors to those that seek advice. And I'm super impressed with some of the partners that we've been involved with recently in how encouraging they are to give you the data or the information that you need in order to make an informed decision. So I would just say to any business owner, don't go alone. Seek advice from reputable people that have trod that path before, because you don't have to make the same mistakes that they did.
Barry, thank you very much.
Pleasure.
Insightful, to say the least, for both two parts there. So thank you so much for coming on the KERVcast.
Pleasure.
Appreciate you coming on.
Pleasure,
Cheers.
mate. Good to see you.